Allison, I can't hear you, so I'm not sure if you're muted or if it's just me.
Allison, I don't think we can hear you.
We're not hearing you. We can't hear. No, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. No. Are you double muted? Maybe. Oh, you're connecting now, maybe.
Hi, okay. And am I back now? I guess when I hit record, I accidentally turned off the entire audio. So, all right, take two. Welcome, everybody. We're really glad to have you. And I'm Allison Brown. I'm a co-president of League of Women Voters Falls Church. And my fellow co-president, Wendy Freeman, is also on. So we're both very happy to welcome you. And thank you so much for joining us today and taking time out of your Sunday to have this civic discussion. And we are very pleased to have Councilwoman Letty Hardi joining us today as our main speaker. And Letty is in her second term in City Council, and she's really been a leader in guiding and overseeing the many development projects that are going on and are proposed in Falls Church City. And also a leader in really listening to the community. She has office hours, she communicates out through an email, and that's been much appreciated by many in our community. I also want to recognize we have a couple of other City Council members who have joined us as audience members today. So thank you very much to Phil Duncan and Mary Beth Connolly for joining us today. We really appreciate having you be part of this discussion as well. And we have a couple other events as League of Women Voters Falls Church coming up soon. On Wednesday, September 23rd at 7:30 in the evening, we are co-hosting with VPIS, the Village Preservation and Improvement Society, a forum for City Council candidates for the special election. There's one seat that's open. We have 3 candidates this year who will be up for election on November 3rd. So we'll hear from them on September 23rd at 7:30. So we're looking forward to that, and we hope you'll all join us. If you're not a member of the League, will you please post your name and email in the chat? We'd love to know who's joining us for this kind of session. And last, I'll mention that we are recording this session, so keep that in mind as we go forward, but we think it'll be a great resource. We'll be posting it on our website so that people can take a look at it even if they can't join us right now. So I'm going to start with a big picture question for Letty. Letty, we want to hear about what do you think are the most important issues facing Falls Church City in the current environment?
First of all, thank you for having me. And I was going to say to Phil and Mary Beth who are joining us, feel free to jump on in too, since there's 3 of us here. Obviously, we are 6 months into this global pandemic and it's not over. So I think that's kind of the elephant in the room. Clearly, that's our #1 issue right now. I think health and safety of our citizens and how our businesses are doing will be our top priority until we come out on the other side. I think I want to acknowledge that we've had 7 deaths in the city of Falls Church and 190,000 across the US. And so that's nothing to laugh at, clearly. And so I think for the most part, we're doing really well. We've had responsible citizens and businesses, and we are kind of seeing this through pretty safely. But clearly the virus really doesn't know borders, right? So we have to think about how we're doing as a region. And there's definitely, some pockets across Virginia where things are going tougher. So I think I certainly sympathize with people on how tough this is between having school-age kids at home, understanding how hard it is to juggle work and home. We know that this hit is hitting everybody really hard. I think unemployment in Falls Church is probably looking similar to many other parts of the country. I think the last data point I had seen was around 9 or 10%. And so we also know that the economy truly doesn't reopen until schools can reopen in some way. And so I think it's been really obvious through this pandemic how childcare and the system around education is so linked to the economy. And so that's something that I know the school board is really committed to solving. So that's kind of our at least top of mind priority for us on City Council, is making sure that our citizens are safe, we can see businesses through. There's certainly no guidebook on how to go about this. And so since March, we really had to figure out and scramble, between shutting everything down and then responding to the pandemic itself. I think to date, we've given about $250,000 in direct small business grants to our businesses who are hurting, about $160,000 in rent relief, on top of utilities and food assistance. So the nonprofit communities definitely come out and done a great job along with the city's HHS staff. Testing continues to probably be the top issue. I think as Virginia is increasing testing, that really has to be continued important focus, because unless you can test and trace, you're really not going to be able to lock this virus down. I think we've also tried to do some innovative things in the city. So increasing outdoor dining, making it easy so there's no government red tape to make it easy for businesses to operate safely during this has been important. Opening up park use for businesses to use. I think our biggest asset in the city is letting people use our open space. And so how can we get creative with that? So I think in the near term, that's definitely the biggest issue. And then kind of from the next 0 to 12 to 18 months is really how to rebound from that. So impacting the businesses, our local government budget is clearly going to be impacted. We passed kind of an interim budget back in May in response, actually in June, in response to the pandemic that was going to be 5% lower than the previous year. And pre-virus, we were thinking that the budget would actually increase 3 to 4%. So a 5% decrease from what we were expecting was a pretty big deal. And we're not done yet. So that was kind of a temporary budget. We expect we'll be revisiting that come September, October timeframe. I think at the end of the day, the underlying economy in Falls Church is strong. So I feel good that we will come out on the other side of it, but clearly acknowledging that it's a really tough time for everybody is important.
Thanks so much. And one of the questions we wanted to ask you is, there's been a lot of talk and action on racial equity. What do you see as the next steps in Falls Church City to really promote racial equity in Falls Church City so that we can live in a place that, that really helps all citizens and, might even be more diverse in the future than it is today?
Yep. So I think everyone was part of kind of the summer and the national reawakening around racial justice. It was really heartening to see, especially seeing the youth in our community really step up. There was just amazing turnout for the Black Lives Matter march that happened on Park Avenue. And Falls Church, I think, is lucky in that we have a really engaged citizenry. We have good intentions. One of the first things I worked on with the current council is that we developed our 2040 vision and our value statement of what this community is going to be about, which is to be welcoming and inclusive. So clearly our hearts are in the right place, which I think is a really important place to start from. But like every community, I think across the US, we have the opportunity to do more. So I would love to see this community do more beyond marches, rallies, yard signs, and name changes. I think it really starts with actual policies. And so one of the things that I'm happy to see, especially around racial justice, that we quickly mobilize to do is, sorry, what was that? That wasn't a question. I think that might have been someone needs to mute, is around the police use of force community. So I think we wanted to respond to that quickly and make sure that we do analysis, hearing from citizens of what our use of force policies were, and make sure we had pretty diverse community representation and analyzing whether there was opportunity for reform. So that's underway now. They'll wrap up this November with recommendations to City Council. But beyond that, I think a couple other opportunities I see in front of us. One, I think we just need to acknowledge that the city of Falls Church is actually the least diverse in the region. And that's not something that I think we should be very proud of. We live in a very diverse DC region, and we have to ask ourselves, why is the city of Falls Church so undiverse? I think it starts with housing. I think for those of you who read my blog, I often talk about how housing is really the foundation of how people, build access and opportunity. And I think we are part of the bigger region where clearly housing prices have gone up a lot, but some of it has to do with our history. I think we need to openly acknowledge kind of some history and some parts of it that were not so pleasant around how we gerrymandered out a historically Black community. And I think there's tons of systemic racism that is embedded in the way housing policy has been done across the US, and Falls Church is likely part of that redlining as well. So I think it starts with acknowledging that history and then figuring out ways that we can go and can make up for it in some ways. One thing we actually talked about this past Tuesday at our council meeting is actually standing up a racial equity board and then also challenging our boards and commissions. So we have a number of boards and commissions, everything from economic development to environment to transportation, actually applying an equity lens in each of those areas to make sure that we are being as thoughtful and welcoming and inclusive in our investments and in our policies. So an example I like to use is actually the library. So even before some of this happened in late spring, the library came to us and said, we want to get rid of overdue fines. Some of you may have seen that, and maybe patrons already of the library. And the reason they want to get rid of overdue fines is it actually brings in very little revenue for the city. But the studies show that it actually disproportionately impacts people of color. And often those families are often the ones who probably benefit most from library materials. So that's just a great example of how using equity might make you make a different policy decision. And there's probably other examples like that. Another one I like to talk about is transportation investments. As City Council, we try to be really responsive to citizen requests. So we often hear about people who want traffic calming or sidewalk improvements. And so when you look across the city, I want to make sure that our transportation investments are equitably distributed across town. Or are we only really responding to the white, affluent, single-family neighborhoods? So that's just another example. So I think hopefully starting this fall, we're going to charge our boards and commissions to apply that equity lens in those policy areas and then come back with recommendations to us. And that's where, again, I really want to emphasize that it has to be more than just saying you stand up for racial equity, you put a yard sign and you vote. It really has to start with policies. And I hope, folks like the League of Women Voters can get engaged in that as well.
Can you say a little more about the use of force committee? I know you don't have the recommendations yet, but what more specifically are they looking at? It's, a written use of force policy. Are there any issues that you already know of, or if or just summarize the use of force policy we have right now so that we can learn a little more about it and what the committee might be looking at over the next couple months?
Yeah, so I don't have much beyond what I said earlier, but I'm happy to share. So I think right now the police does a pretty good job of actually thinking about use of force as a spectrum, right? It's not like a one size fits all. And I think they're evaluating, is that the right policy? Is that something that are there more innovative things that people are doing? Because it is evolving, it's not a static thing. The thing that I'm happy to say is that Chief Gavin has certainly a very open community mindset of trying to do continuous improvement. And she was part of several progressive movements around the Obama era to actually incorporate more progressive use of force policies there.
We do have a question in the chat, if I could interject.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, with all the commercial development happening, do we require developers to provide affordable housing incentives?
Great question. Yes. So it's not a requirement per se, because with the way Virginia does development, it is part of our voluntary concessions and is a standard package of things that we normally ask for. So with each development, that's actually where we get the majority of our affordable housing that we add to our stock today. As it stands, the policy generally is that 6% of new units have to be affordable, and affordable can be defined currently as 60% of area median income. And so it's people who, the average median income for a family of 4 in this area is about 100,000. And so we target between the 60 to 80% of AMI, so between 60 to 80,000 income for a family of 4 to be able to afford the rent of those buildings. So let's say you build something with 300 units, 6% would give you 18 units or so. So that's actually where the majority of our units have been added in terms of the city's affordable housing stock the past 15, 20 years. But the reality also is that we are losing them faster than we build them, right? Because we only do a development project like Founders Row, which is underway every 3 to 5 years. And you can't just add 18 units every 3 to 5 years because the demand is certainly higher than that currently. But that is a standard concession we get with each new development. And that's often one of the benefits of development, is that we are able to actually get developer concessions to help add to the affordable housing stock.
Just a follow up on that, and then I have another question in the chat. A follow up on that is, given that some of the affordable housing is expected to be up in a year or so, is there a plan to offer more grants and incentives? Or how are we going to try to keep that equilibrium of the current stock of low housing that we have?
A great question. I could talk about housing probably all day. So I think one of the first things we need to do is actually preserve the housing we have, because it's actually a quite large concession that developers.
New car?
Oh, I think we need to mute. If you're not asking a question, if you could mute, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, so I think we need to preserve what we've got. The most common one you might have heard about is a housing development called the Fields. It has 96 units kind of located in the western part of the city. To lose 96 units all at once would be terrible for the city. It's a lot of where the diversity comes from in Falls Church. And so that is one project in particular that I think we need to be really focused on preserving. But the first priority, I think, is you have to preserve them, because if you lose 96 units there, or you lose some of the other ones. So pre-Founders Row, most of the affordable housing that have been built at, say, the Spectrum, the Byron, Pearson Square, those had a 20-year affordability provision. And we're getting close to that point now where a lot of them are actually rolling off the books. And so while we've only been talking about the Field, it's also important to think about pretty much every other mixed-use project in town also has them expiring. So I'd love to make sure we actually look at how much would it cost for us to preserve them, and then preserve the Field, and then also add to the stock on top of that, because I don't think it's enough for us to just add new stock and then ignore that there's obviously families living in these that are going to expire and the rent's going to go up.
There's another couple of questions in the chat. One is on the census. Any idea of the status of the census response in the city of Falls Church? My daughter asked how many African Americans live in Lincoln at Tinner Hill.
So on the census question, the last I saw was about 80% response, which I think has exceeded previous response. So I think we're doing pretty well. I think in general, you see that census response is tied to socioeconomic status in the region. And so I think as a whole, Falls Church is probably doing very well in that regard, but there's still probably census workers out there knocking on doors and trying to get more before the deadline coming up. And then the second question was how many live at the Lincoln and Tinner Hill? Do they mean Tinner Hill in particular, or the new development Lincoln at Tinner Hill, the building?
It's not clear. It says, just asked how many African Americans live at Lincoln at Tinner Hill.
Okay, so the Lincoln at Tinner Hill is a standalone building, and that's where it's kind of above target. I don't actually know the numbers off the top of my head, but I do know that the percentage of kind of African American citizens in Falls Church is pretty low.
There's also a shout out to the council for unanimously voting for new gun regulations to keep the city safe. So a huge shout out and thank you to all of the city council members. And then Wendy, do you want to ask your question? Because I'm not entirely sure.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, when you were talking about incentives, is that what has been traditionally known as a proffer? When I first started getting involved with the league and local affairs, I was hearing all the time about proffers.
Yeah, so in other states they're called proffers, but with the way Virginia does development, we're not allowed to call them proffers. They're called voluntary concessions. But yes, it's essentially kind of when a developer offers up in return for granting a certain height or certain amount of density. Affordable housing is one of several that we get. Often they provide capital contributions, i.e. cash, that go straight to our libraries or parks, the schools. They offer voluntary concessions for stormwater because they might be taking up like a parking lot, for example. We have several developments that have gone in the place of dilapidated parking lots, and they can do a lot with stormwater. And so there's a number of concessions that we often ask for. I often call it kind of the kitchen sink model, because usually everybody gets a little bit of everything and the kitchen sink as part of those VCs.
Following up on the gun safety regulations, agreeing on the shout out regarding gun safety regulations, but the question is there anything more that's being considered that we could do on a local level as it relates to gun control and keeping the city safe?
That's a good question. I feel like the local authority to restrict guns in public places was probably the one that we've been asking for. It really was the top request that we had. There's certainly, I think, more that we can do around common sense gun legislation, but I think that makes sense to do at the state level. So more background checks, the red flag laws, all those I think that many people, majority of Americans do support, I do think has to happen at the Virginia level. But the local authority is really important, and especially I think as a region. I was just actually talking to Katie Crystal in Arlington yesterday, so they just adopted theirs yesterday afternoon, and then Fairfax County is having their big meeting on Tuesday. So assuming that Fairfax County also adopts something that looks pretty similar to us, Northern Virginia as a whole is going to have the same laws around that, which I think is important for citizens to understand and make it easier for enforcement and for also citizens understanding.
Do you know whether those other jurisdictions have had the influx of people outside the jurisdiction that are opposing those particular laws, or was that unique to Falls Church City?
definitely not unique. The city of Alexandria had warned me that since they were the first in the region to do it, they had warned us that we'd be hearing from a lot of people. So I don't think we are unique in that regard.
Another question is, when are we getting body cameras for the police force? Is there an update on that?
I don't have an update on it. I know it's probably on the list of things for them to consider, either as part of the use of force committee or just a separate budget item. I think in the past, when we brought it up with in other previous budget cycles, it was always a matter of the value that I think that we thought they would bring versus the cost, and then what would be a reasonable schedule to kind of get everyone cameras. I think obviously with a lot more focus on the police these days and accountability, I think it's certainly going to be a higher priority discussion.
And what was the cost? Has the police use of force been an issue in Falls Church? So those are two questions. What was the cost, and has use of force been an issue in Falls Church?
I don't remember the cost offhand, so I don't want to quote you the wrong number. But to my knowledge, I have not actually seen a concern with use of force, but I know part of what the use of force committee is going to do is actually look at all the data. So I think from what I saw of Steve Mason, who's actually our HR director and also has police experience from Alexandria, he's the staff member leading this group. And so what he asked everyone on the committee to do is actually review about 10 years worth of data. Any complaints we've gotten are on use of force. So doing a pretty comprehensive look at that. But as a city council member for the past 4.5 years, I have not heard any complaints where people have actually had concerns with excessive use of force in town. So that's good to hear. But again, always, I do think that that's where the data is important, right? Like we want to look at what it shows rather than just anecdotes.
Yes, there's a general consensus on it. Glad that you're looking at the data. And is there any sense of the timing of when that review of the data will be completed?
Yeah, so November is when the committee is delivering recommendations to us. So as of this past Tuesday, when the city manager reported to us, November is when we'll hear recommendations from the committee.
Great, thank you.
And those are public meetings. Anyone can actually join them. They're advertised on the city website. And so I'm sure the committee would actually welcome members of the public to join in or at least watch.
And then we also just listed, for those who aren't following the chat, there's a good article on police body cams at MIT, and we listed the link to that if people are interested. So just to highlight if you're not following the chat. The maybe more of a state issue, but is there anything to be done at the local level to increase solar energy incentives? So switching now to a different topic on energy, what are we doing on solar energy incentives?
So I actually think there was legislation passed, and obviously with COVID, a lot of important things that actually happened in Richmond got eclipsed by everyone focused on COVID. But actually as part of the big 2020 legislative session in Richmond, where we got things like local authority on guns, they actually passed a number of environmental laws. And so one of which was around solar and making it easier for local jurisdictions and citizens to have more solar. So I think some of it hopefully will trickle down into Falls Church soon, but I do think that some of it was at the state level. And not one in particular that'll impact us is removing the caps. So previously, Dominion's a pretty big lobby in Richmond. So they had actually asked for caps on how much solar and alternative energy sources could be done. And so I think part of that legislation removed the caps to a more reasonable amount, because obviously it doesn't benefit them if there's a lot of people moving to solar versus their energy.
And then going back to housing, are our zoning policies and decisions partly responsible for the lack of affordable housing in Falls Church? It's a complicated topic, we know, but and we want to understand it better. But if you could talk a little bit about what is causing this.
Yes. So definitely, I feel like zoning relates to everything. And 4 years into this job, I realized that so much of my job relates to zoning, and I've learned more about zoning and housing laws than I thought I would. So I definitely think zoning is a part of it. So as it stands, when you think about our 2.2 square miles, I want to say 60 to 70% of the land in Falls Church is actually zoned only for single family homes. So it is illegal to build anything else except single family, right? So when you look at obviously a map of Falls Church and you look down at it, there's a lot of single family neighborhoods. And we are not immune to the growing increase of house prices in the area. So that's definitely part of it, is that it's just a really desirable place to live as a whole in DC. And then in the city of Falls Church, obviously the schools drive a big part of that. People want to go to where there are great school districts. So there's definitely market forces at play, but zoning plays a role in it, because if you have majority of your land zoned only for single family homes, then you don't create options for other types of housing. And so one term you might have heard either me say or people in the region talk about is actually what's called missing middle. There's a whole bunch of housing that's we don't have as a whole in the region. So missing middle would be housing like more townhomes. I think the last time we had townhomes was probably the Whittier development off Hillwood, and then obviously the Winter Hill one and a couple other small developments. We also don't have a ton of condos. We haven't built condos probably in 15, 20 years now since the condo boom and bust happened. And so what we've done in Falls Church, and rightfully so, as you know, what we needed to do 20 years ago was really balance out our demographics, is what I've been thinking was kind of a barbell strategy, right? We have single family homes on one end, and then we built apartments on the other end, because we needed to diversify both our commercial tax base as well as our demographics. But what we left in the middle was this gap. The barbell strategy meant we didn't create a lot of middle housing options for people who were looking for more than an apartment, but not necessarily a single family home. And there's a whole bunch of complexities involved in, you know, why that is. But I think zoning definitely is one part of it. I think zoning offers opportunity for us to think more creatively. And so when you look at places like Minneapolis and Seattle, some people might think it's pretty radical, but they have done a lot more progressive housing reform around their zoning code, allowing things like granny flats. So accessory dwelling units is what they're commonly called. So imagine kind of a shed-ish, you know, in your backyard that you could allow your elderly parents to move into, or you could rent out as an alternative source of income. Places like Seattle, Minneapolis have also added and allowed for duplexes and quads. So allowing the same amount of land that a single family home would occupy, but allow for multiple families to live there. So it's something that definitely requires, I think, more thought, because there's always a lot of unintended consequences we need to make sure we're careful of when you touch zoning. But I think zoning definitely plays a large role in the types of housing we have. And I'm a big fan of making sure we diversify the housing types we have.
And how difficult is it to change the zoning laws?
Hard, mainly because I think it's a complex issue. And so the one zoning that we had done, big zoning change we had done as a council several years ago was adding the ability to do cottages. So I want to say that we're one of the first, maybe on the East Coast, to do cottage zoning, to allow essentially 10 tiny houses in a way. And I think some of you may be familiar with the railroad development that's off the bike path. That required new zoning to enable that kind of housing, where it was, you know, like a 1,500 square foot, which, you know, would be considered small for Falls Church standards, to be built in lieu of 4 large single family houses on that parcel. And so that zoning process probably took about 18 months to 2 years. And then development on top of that took a couple of years. So it's definitely not an overnight thing, because I think between making sure we heard all the concerns from the neighbors and understanding implications of creating zoning that would allow housing like that is definitely not a short-term thing.
And can you just elaborate a little bit on how zoning laws can be changed, or what the process is?
So there are council decisions. Normally we bring in, you know, outside help because it's a pretty complicated subject, but it's a council decision that requires several votes and work sessions, and obviously lots of community input along the way. But it's something that's kind of written into the city code.
There's some comments about affordable dwelling units needing to be allowed in grandparent plants, but also just a comment that the cost for those cottages were sort of out of reach, unfortunately, for maybe what the intended purpose was.
Agreed. And to be fair, I think the railroad cottages were never intended to be affordable. I think they started at $700,000, which in my book is not affordable. I would love for us to actually figure out how to bring down the cost of those. So those had, I think they were either net zero or had really upscale amenities associated with them. And so I think there's a way to, you know, at least figure out whether you can build them more affordably, because I do often hear that people want to downsize from a single family home, but don't necessarily want to go to a condo or apartment. And so something small with a small footprint like cottages could be a really great fit for them. But agreed, I would love to see them more affordable too.
That's all the questions in the chat at the moment. Allison, I don't know if you want to go back to some of your questions.
Sure. Let's talk a little bit about voting. What's your sense of whether Falls Church City is prepared for this election? That early voting will start on September 18th, this Friday. So what's your sense of how Falls Church City is doing, getting prepared, and will be ready, you know, through November 3rd?
Good question. So I think as a whole, Falls Church normally is really proud of the fact that we're really engaged citizenry. I think we usually have one of the top voter turnout percentages, especially for this presidential election, and the general sentiment I sense in kind of neighborhoods. I don't expect that to be different. So I expect hopefully, 80+% turnout for this one. In terms of preparedness, I actually just saw the Washington Post article that as a whole, Virginia is doing a really good job of responding to how to vote safely in this pandemic. And I think Dave Bjerke and the rest of his team is doing an excellent job with preparing for that. So the last update I heard from him over the weekend is that we had about a third of registered voters request mail-in ballots, so about 3,000, which is amazing to see that many people want to vote by mail. And then with the start of early voting happening this coming Friday, I expect a large number of people will choose that option as opposed to going in on November 3rd. The last update I also heard is that the ballot drop box, one of several I think, just got installed between the City Hall and Community Center. So that is a great option that if you did get a mail-in absentee ballot, instead of having to worry about whether it'll get lost in the mail, you can actually just drop it off at City Hall. So I think they're doing everything they can. I know that as part of the budget deliberations this past spring, we did find money to fund kind of one FTE for an assistant registrar position, knowing that there was going to be so much work to do with both the presidential election and responding to the pandemic. So I'm glad that we made that happen too.
There's another question in the chat that says, how important do you feel it is to succeed in approving the project that would bring a Whole Foods to Falls Church?
Thank you for that question. I think in general, we want to make sure that any development we do kind of meets the community's standards, right? So I hold a pretty high bar for what I think development should do. I'm generally very pro-development because I do think it brings a number of positives, but I think any development, obviously, there's more to it than the headlines. So I want to make sure that we really look at not only the architecture, the community benefits, what it would do to neighboring businesses, and make sure that the benefits outweigh the cons with that project. So I think it's an important corner of the city. Some people argue that it's the most important corner of Falls Church. So I do want to make sure that what we do approve there is right for the city in the long run.
So what are the things that you're considering in terms of benefits and cons of that particular development? What are some of the top issues there?
Yeah, so one of the top one, I think for me in particular, mainly because we've been saying it for 9 months and I don't like being a broken record, is we had asked the developers to make sure that they had addressed the interim and permanent parking. So the original 2018 version of the Broad and Washington project was going to be an office building and then apartments and a new home for Creative Cauldron. And we ended up, voting for that in 2018, and we were actually thrilled with it because one of the long-term goals for that corner is actually add more foot traffic. I think one thing that's important for our downtown businesses is you need a daytime population, right? You can't just have people who live there and then retail on the ground floor, because at the end of the day, these businesses want a lunch crowd. And so adding an office building at the corner was really important. And so we were actually really happy about the 2018 version. And so when the new version came in at the end of last year that involved a Whole Foods plus a proposal to buy the city parking lot. And the city parking lot's one off Park Place. It's behind Clarendon's and State Theater. That obviously makes it more complicated because it no longer had the office with the daytime population and the lunch crowd that I think we were excited about. So a big part that I've been asking for, I guess, 9 months now is to make sure we address the interim parking issue. It has about 64 spaces back there. And obviously the State Theater, Clarendon's, and Thompson Italian, which are 3 beloved businesses in the downtown area, would be pretty impacted. So we want to make sure that they responded and actually had a good solid plan that would be fair and reasonable, because we know at the end of the day, the businesses will be impacted. But I personally think it's important that there was a reasonable plan in place before the project moves forward. And as of this past Tuesday, they still could not produce that plan for me. And so I expressed my disappointment that I felt like that needed to be a threshold issue we resolve before the project goes further.
2 questions. We're going to bounce around a little bit. The first one, it's a question about the car sticker / tax. That seemed like a good idea. And the question is, will it pass?
I think so. I didn't hear any major concerns that, at least from our work session. I personally, I think all of us are fans of not having to replace a sticker every year. It's just kind of a pain, and sometimes people forget it. In general, what I spoke about is I'd actually love to see where we don't use stickers and actually use more automated methods of enforcement, because there are cameras that do that. But I think the challenge is obviously finding the resources to drive the car around that has the camera and the scanner mounted on, and that takes more time and people. But in general, I think where there are places that we can automate things, I'd rather do that than a manual, a traffic enforcement officer going out and actually manually looking to see whether the sticker's in place. But I think as it stands, I didn't hear any major concerns with the treasurer's recommendation in work session this past week.
So following up on sort of budget and savings, the question is, why should taxpayers be on the hook to pay for parking spots for private businesses? And then also, is there any other saving measures that the city can do?
saving measures for?
In general, I think the first question is specifically on why should taxpayers be on the hook for paying for parking spots for private business? That's the first question. The second is a general question on any savings measures that you would like to see instituted on behalf of the city. And then we're going to go back to balloting. So,
okay. So on the parking spots, agreed. In general, parking is really, really expensive. I think most people are surprised that as part of developments as a whole, it's around $40,000 of parking spaces, how much they're valued. Wow. And so the fact that we have a public parking lot there, I think is an important kind of city amenity. And so whether it's used for 3 particular businesses or people who are coming downtown, I think it's important kind of amenity to have in the downtown. I think we aspire to be multimodal, but that's obviously a long-term thing. Like people aren't going to get out of their cars immediately, even if we have desires for them to. And part of it is I think you have to create infrastructure for them to make it easy to walk and bike. But at the end of the day, some people still have cars. And these businesses also need people to come beyond Falls Church borders to patronize them, right? We only have 15,000 residents here. And I think for businesses to survive, we want to attract people outside of Falls Church to get here. And right now, as it stands, some people choose to drive. So I understand the concern about, the perception that we're subsidizing these private businesses with parking lots. But I think as part of a well-functioning downtown, I think those 64 spaces are important for all the businesses in the downtown area. And I think I heard the second question was around savings. I assume like where can we save money as a whole in the city?
Yeah. If you look at the budget, what are some of the other saving measures you'd like the city to take up?
So that's always a question that we bring up every year because every year we try to figure out where can we save money in the budget. We always look at kind of where we can save across city and schools. I feel like I bring that up every year as part of the city budget process. Like, are there shared IT resources, shared groundskeeping? For example, someone who's taking care of the parks in the city versus taking care of the fields at the schools. Is that an opportunity where we can share? And so I think one thing that I'm happy to see is that the working relationship with the schools is a really good place. And so I think the city manager and superintendent have talked about opportunities to share resources. So that's definitely one area that we always push on every year. And hopefully, I guess with tight budgets that are expected this coming year might be conversations we have to have again.
Going back to election, there is a question on how will we assure the security of the ballot drop box?
So it's probably a better question for Dave Bjerke because I don't think we officially have gotten a message on council that they were installed and ready to go. And so I don't want to speak incorrectly, but I can certainly follow up on that after we ask about it this coming meeting.
Great, thank you. That's it for the chat box for the moment. Allison, if you want to.
Yeah, picking up on the theme of budget, I think it would be helpful if you would walk through the timeline for budget. First of all, you mentioned that City Council will be coming back to budget issues this fall. And, what do you expect to be the main topics as that part of that conversation? And then heading into 2021, what's the timeline? If citizens want to get involved in providing input, when's the best time? I know there are always public meetings, but what do you see happening in 2021 on that?
Yeah, so this year is kind of a weird budget year. So normally the budget's done by the end of April, but like I said, we passed kind of a temporary budget for FY21 with COVID and not knowing exactly how it's going to impact our revenues. But the temporary budget that we passed, like I said, was about 5% lower than the previous year's budget. So coming kind of September and October after the fiscal year ends, we're going to reevaluate kind of how revenues finally did, and then where there may be opportunities that we need to adjust the budget. So in some ways, we're going to come off of one budget cycle and not have any time to really have a breather and then start again. So the typical budget year for us starts around the November, December timeframe. What council does that you may have heard is pass something called budget guidance. And so guidance usually is essentially guidance to city staff, to the schools that says, hey, based on what the revenue picture looks like, we want you to grow your budget X%. And that's kind of where the city and schools then take that guidance and try to craft their budgets. So that's kind of that first big decision is the budget guidance that gets issued at the end of the year, usually around the December timeframe. From there, there's a number of staff meetings, and departments kind of put together their budgets based on that guidance. They try to stick to, whatever the growth guidance we gave them as close as possible. The schools work really hard kind of in the January, February timeframe. And then in March, the city manager presents kind of the total budget, and then the schools present their part of the budget. And then from kind of the March to April timeframe, we have a number of work sessions and community town halls where we kind of share, here's what the budget looks like. Here's pluses and minuses to it. We mark up the budget, and then usually it gets adopted by the end of April.
There's a question in the chat that says, how can policy be implemented to move from talking to action on making the city walkable? We talk a lot about walking, and then policy builds more public parking, which incentivizes people to drive, so seemingly inconsistent.
So good question. I think that we actually have a large number of good policies in place, but I think it has to do, frankly, with budget. So we have, and I think policy is only good if you actually have money that goes and supports it, right? So you can create all these policies, they sit on a shelf, and then if nobody looks at it, then it doesn't matter. So we actually have multiple plans. We have a bicycle master plan that shows kind of here's where all the bike routes should be. We have sidewalk plans. But at the end of the day, we need to actually have money that goes towards them. So starting 2 years ago, one thing that I pushed really hard on is making sure we had money for sidewalk improvements. Because if you're a pedestrian in town, what I often lamented back when my kids were stroller age is you'd be walking on a sidewalk and suddenly it would just end. We have a number of missing link sidewalks where you have sidewalks that just end in the middle of nowhere, or no sidewalks in completely that whole neighborhood and you're just walking in the middle of the street. Sidewalks are amazingly expensive. They're generally around $100,000 to $200,000 just for a mini block or so. And so I think part of it is just finding money in the budget. So obviously budgets are always about trade-offs. And so we've taken on a number of capital projects, but one thing that I've been at least proud to see is the past couple budget cycles, we've been able to carve out some money for sidewalk improvements and creating kind of more biking routes around town. I think the other part that's important is making sure citizens understand the benefit of the walkability and can actually help make those trade-offs in the neighborhoods. So even though we have something called like the bicycle master plan that identifies here's all the biking routes. One example I like to point out is Southwest Street was pointed out as one of the major bicycle routes in Falls Church. It connects to kind of the WNOD and obviously other parts of town. And when it was time to repave Southwest a couple of years ago, a plan was put on the table. It says, gosh, we can add a dedicated bike lane on Southwest. But all the neighbors in there were really upset about losing dedicated parking in front of their street. And so as a result, city staffs, updated plan to make it kind of a sharo instead of sharo, meaning shared kind of bike lane and park and driving lane, because people really wanted to preserve parking in front of the street. So I hear you. I would love to do more around walkability and bikeability. And I think as a council, we've done a good job the past several years. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to budget and making sure that your voices are heard, that you want to see those investments as part of the budget, but that usually comes as a trade-off, right? So where else do you want to take money away from in order to invest in things like sidewalks and bike lanes?
And is there any thought to adding lights for sidewalks in the neighborhoods?
Do you mean like street lights?
Yeah, like
it's been raised, and I think the one thing that we are doing this coming budget year is actually updating all the street lights to be LED. So that was something that was part of the budget that was recommended. And so that is where kind of the walkability, because we know that obviously having well-lit sidewalks is important too. I don't know whether that plan includes adding new lights or what the process looks like, but I know that we are upgrading all the lights to be LEDs.
That's all the questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay. And one of the issues on the November ballot will be the special election for city council. And we really haven't had a special election for city council in decades. Any comments on that in terms of how you expect the process to play out? And, and then once the election concludes on November 3rd, when does that person take office? How's that going to work?
So obviously with Dan's passing, and obviously 2020 has just been a really tough year with so many losses. Dan is just really irreplaceable. I think it goes without saying that, but the fact that we have 3 candidates who stepped up so quickly, I think is terrific. When I was the newbie 4.5 years ago, I really wanted to make sure that new voices were being heard. So I was thrilled that we actually had so much interest, and from pretty different parts of the city too, which I think is important to make sure that the next generation is stepping up. I think the fact that all 3 candidates have talked about equity, housing, and affordability as big parts of their platform is a win for the cause overall. So in general, I'm just thrilled to see that it's kind of, one of the top issues that hopefully will push us as a council, regardless of who gets elected, to move on those items.
And when would a new person take office?
January, I think soon January is when they would do the swearing in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I haven't heard of a different date.
And going back to the budget for a minute, tell us a little more about the guidance that happens in November, December. You know, if individuals are interested in advocacy on the budget, is it important to do that advocacy before you even come up with budget guidance, or is it more effective if individuals are advocating, you know, in January, closer in time to the adoption of the budget? Talk through some of those issues and how those calendar issues play out.
Yeah, so I'm always happy to hear from people early on. Like early on, I think is always better. So I think if you have input on, gosh, we want to see more investment in these areas versus these areas, I think as with any project or development, giving input early on is probably better. I think we have the budget guidance document itself is a formal thing that we vote on. So there's always public comment that people can, you know, chime in on then. But if people want to comment on where they think more investment should happen in the city, I think early is always good. To set expectations, though, I do expect it to be a pretty tough budget. Unlike previous years where we had, you know, 3 or 4% revenue growth, the fact that obviously everyone's budgets are impacted because of COVID with the loss of revenues. I don't think we're going to be in position to talk about where can we add things in the budget, and hope it'll probably be a tougher conversation of where we might have to take things away, because I don't think anybody wants to increase taxes either.
And any tips for citizen advocacy during this time of social distancing? Anything you can suggest that's been effective since we've all been staying at home more and limitations on meetings? Any suggestions for citizens?
Citizens in terms of kind of how to kind of stay in touch, or?
Yeah, how to stay in touch, how to get input to city council. Certainly there's email, but do you have any advice on how to craft emails that are more useful to city council and might get a little more attention than, you know, your average one-sentence email?
Yes, so I always value actually just personal emails and outreach. So the form letters, for example, we got tons of form emails when we were dealing with the gun issues. And while I read every one of them, they certainly don't make as much of an impact compared to personal messages. And so I know all 6 of us are always happy to hear from you over email or phone calls. I've done a few kind of socially distanced meetups with people, so I'm always happy to do that. But I think at the end of the day, we're such a small city that I think we all view our jobs as kind of volunteer gigs and not big political jobs. So I'm always happy to hear from people just as neighbors and citizens about whatever might be on their mind.
And what about online petitions? Is it, you know, worth the time to start an online petition, to sign an online petition, or has that been overused to the point that they're not as effective now as maybe they were 10 years ago or 15 years ago?
We don't get that. I mean, we've gotten a couple of, like, obviously with the gun vote, we got several petitions with that. And I think with Broad and Washington, we had some neighborhood letters where a number of citizens signed. So I'm always happy to hear from them. I think if people want to sign on to a petition, I think that's a great way to communicate with council effectively too.
Okay, does anyone in the audience have follow-ups or a last question? We have just a few minutes before we're going to close up, but this has been a really great conversation.
There's just one comment in the chat that said that they thought November 4th would be the first day of the new city council members' term. So just FYI.
Yeah, well, that's probably, yeah, helpful so you have a full complement of people sooner rather than later.
I think the results of the election have to be certified. We should ask that question, though. I don't think that I have.
We've never explicitly discussed it, to my knowledge.
Yeah, I don't think that. I mean, the election is for, you know, the new term. I'm not sure the election is to. We say to fill the vacancy, but I'm not sure. Anyway, we need to ask the clerk and the city attorney that question. Stormwater, Letty, something about stormwater?
So stormwater obviously was one of the top issues that we were dealing with pre-COVID. And because of the budget, we had paused adding to the budget to kind of meet the stormwater request. So we had put together a stormwater committee, and we had a great actually citizen panel that worked on stormwater. And they have a bunch of recommendations on where across all the city projects we should invest. We had to table that because of COVID, and I think there was no appetite to really increase the tax rate to fund those projects. But clearly, we've had a number of flooding issues that have continued through the summer, so we know that it's definitely an acute issue for parts of the city. So I think coming this September, end of September, I want to say, we have actually a work session where those task force recommendations are going to be shared with us. And then the city manager will share kind of budget implications of what it would take to get those done. So we know that people have had to wait for those, and I'm hoping that we can find a way that we can do it, meet the demand of those projects, but also do it in a reasonable way for the budget too.
Maybe this is a good last question for not only Letty, but all of our representatives. What keeps you up at night in your job on City Council?
Besides my kids, you mean, I guess. So what keeps me up at night? So I have to go back to that housing issue, because housing for me has just been so important. I think it's not just for the sake of housing people, but it ultimately has to do with, in my mind, sustainability of the city. When I think about what's important for Falls Church to continue and to thrive as a vibrant city, it means housing everybody. And I don't think we do a great job of that today. And I think we have a ways to go. So when I think about what Falls Church, if we want to be a standalone independent city, we have to keep doing everything we're doing. But I think making sure we solve the housing issue is probably a big part of it. The other is, this council certainly has not shied away from doing a lot of things. We've been a really ambitious council that have taken on a large number of capital projects. And in preparation for this, actually, I went back to my 2019 Legal Women Voters voter guide. One of the questions was, what do you think the most important issue is? And at the time I had written is that we're juggling lots of balls. And obviously no one predicted COVID. And so I worried that because we have so many balls in the air with our large capital projects and trying to do so much, I think, on walkability, pedestrian development, obviously the high school, and taking on large debt for City Hall and the library, is making sure we juggle all those balls effectively, especially in the middle of the pandemic. So two things, one kind of in the near term, and then the other is just the longer range, what does it mean to be Falls Church, and how do we stay kind of a sustainable, independent city?
Great, thank you. Do our other audience participated elected officials want to chime in? Are they still with us?
Mary Beth, your turn.
My turn. Oh, this is Mary Beth Connolly. Thanks, Letty, for all that you said. And I would have to agree with Letty on both of those things. Those are the things that keep me up at night. And everything that Letty said about budget upcoming there are going to be a lot of big decisions that we have to make when we finally get all the information in front of us about what kind of funding we have available and how can we keep our city sustainable. So those are the things that keep me up as well.
I think you're doing a good job in city council, or any sort of job like this, when you make everyone upset, because it's always this balancing act and we have to make hard choices and we never please anybody. So expect that, I guess, in the next 6 months or so. I'm always happy to hear from you. If you don't read my blog yet, I'm happy to subscribe you. Always happy to get your emails, but I was saying before the meeting started, it's personally really cathartic for me to write, because often during a council meeting, you don't get to say everything you want to say. And no offense, Nick, but sometimes you don't cover all the things that happen in city council. And so if you want to subscribe, I'm always happy to add you to the list.
Thanks so much. It's such a great resource for Falls Church City residents to find out what's going on, because and those city council meetings go on very late. So those of us that are not late night people can't stay awake that long. But thank you so much to Letty for sharing all of your expertise with us. Thanks also to Sarah Kemp, who planned this and ran it with us. And thank you for everybody who joined. We're really happy to have you and be part of this civic discussion. And we are planning more civic discussions in the near future. The very next one is the City Council Forum. We'll hear from all 3 City Council candidates on Wednesday, September 23rd at 7:30 p.m. We're co-hosting that with VPIS, Village Preservation Improvement Society, and we will have the link out for the virtual forum very soon. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us and spending your time here, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Hope you have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you,
Letty.
Good afternoon.